Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing the places and times of day or night these documented stories reach. On the 23rd of June, 1857, the Moore residence on East Charlton Street fell silent in a way that even the summer cicadas seemed to respect. The dilapidated three-story Georgian home, once the pride of Savannah's historic district, had become the subject of whispered conversations among the locals. Richard Moore, a respected cotton merchant known for his impeccable ledgers and cold demeanor, had abruptly announced that his 19-year-old daughter Clara had departed for a finishing school in Boston. What puzzled the community wasn't her sudden departure. Wealthy families often sent their daughters north for education, but rather the strange timing, midsummer, when no respectable institution would begin new admissions. Even more peculiar was that Clara's twin sister, Kora, remained behind, though she had become increasingly scarce at social gatherings. The household servants, primarily a woman named Harriet Johnston, who had been with the family since the twins' birth, was seen at the market that morning with swollen eyes and trembling hands. When questioned by Mrs. Elizabeth Harrington, the baker's wife, Harriet simply stated, "Some houses keep their own counsel, ma'am," before hurrying away with her purchases partially wrapped. The following day, Sheriff Thomas Wilson noted in his logbook that he had received an unusual request from Richard Moore to investigate trespassers on his property, though nothing seemed disturbed or missing when he arrived. What Sheriff Wilson didn't record, according to his grandson's later testimony to the Savannah Historical Society in 1964, was the peculiar smell emanating from the basement door, a mixture of vinegar and something indefinably worse, and how Richard had blocked his path when he instinctively moved toward it. "Some cellars flood in the summer heat," Richard had explained. "Nothing worth investigating. It would be another 8 months before anyone would question Clara Moore's absence again." The Savannah of 1857 was a city of stark contrasts. Elegant mansions with ornate ironwork and sweeping verandas stood alongside cramped quarters and busy marketplaces. The Moore residence occupied a curious position in the social fabric of the city. Richard Moore had arrived from Charleston some 20 years earlier, establishing himself quickly through shrewd business practices and an advantageous marriage to Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of a declining but still respected plantation family. Their union produced twin daughters in 1838, an event that coincided with Eleanor's gradual withdrawal from society. According to the parish records at Christ Church, Eleanor attended services regularly until the twins' birth, after which her attendance became sporadic and eventually ceased altogether by 1842. The twins, Clara and Cora, were identical in appearance, but reportedly opposite in temperament. Clara, according to her former tutor, Miss Margaret Phillips, possessed a sharp intellect and sharper tongue, while Kora was described as dutiful to the point of disappearance. What few people outside the household knew was that Eleanor Moore had not, as publicly claimed, succumbed to consumption in 1847, but had instead been quietly transferred to the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville. The transfer papers, discovered during a records reorganization in 1963, indicated melancholia with violent tendencies as the cause for admission. The document bore Richard Moore's signature and a curious notation from the admitting physician. Patient exhibits extreme agitation when discussing her daughters, particularly regarding what she terms unnatural symmetry in their behaviors. In the decade following Eleanor's institutionalization, the Moore household maintained a respectable, if somewhat isolated position in Savannah society. Richard's business thrived, particularly as tensions between North and South intensified and cotton prices rose. The twins, educated at home rather than at the Savannah Female Seminary like most girls of their station, were seen primarily at church functions and occasional musical evenings. Harriet Johnston, who had been Eleanor's lady's maid before becoming the household's primary servant, managed the domestic affairs with quiet efficiency. What neighbours occasionally remarked upon, though never directly to Richard Moore, was the curious habit the family had of keeping nearly all windows shuttered, regardless of season, and how the twins were never seen apart until the spring of 1857, when Clara began appearing at social functions alone, explaining that Kora suffered from delicate health. On April 15, 1857, Dr. James Mercer was summoned to the Moore residence shortly before midnight. According to his medical ledger, preserved in the Savannah Medical Historical Collection, he attended to female patient age 19, presenting with lacerations to forearms and pronounced nervousness. The patient's name was not recorded, which was unusual for Dr. Mercer, known for his meticulous record-keeping. More telling was his notation: household atmosphere oppressive. Patient reluctant to speak in presence of family. Recommend removal to more salubrious environment. 3 days later, Richard Moore withdrew a significant sum from his account at First Bank of Savannah, according to bank records examined during the 1869 investigation. The teller, William Hayes, later recalled Moore appearing unusually agitated and requesting the funds in small denominations. That same evening, Cora Moore was seen by at least 3 witnesses walking alone near Forsyth Park, her behavior described as erratic by Mrs. Catherine Dunwood, who observed her from her carriage. She was muttering to herself and stopping occasionally to press her hands against her ears, as though hearing something distressing, Mrs. Dunwood told her sister in correspondence dated April 19th. The following morning, Clara Moore made her first solo appearance at the Stevensons' tea gathering, where she announced that her sister had taken ill with nervous exhaustion and would be resting at home for the foreseeable future. What struck several attendees, including young Sophia Wellington, was Clara's unusually animated demeanour. "She laughed more freely than I had ever witnessed," Sophia later wrote in her diary, and spoke at length about her plans to travel north, something neither twin had expressed interest in previously. Perhaps most disturbing was an exchange overheard by the Wellington servant, Thomas, who was serving refreshments when Clara was asked directly about her sister's condition. According to Thomas's statement to Sheriff Wilson in 1858, Clara smiled in a manner he described as not reaching her eyes, and replied, "Kora will never trouble herself with social obligations again. She has found her true purpose at home." The explanation offered for Clara Moore's abrupt departure on that June day was simple, and at first glance entirely plausible. Richard Moore informed their pastor, Reverend Jonathan Edwards of Christ Church, that Clara had received an invitation to attend Catherine Beecher's Hartford Female Seminary, a prestigious opportunity that required immediate departure. He produced a letter which the Reverend later described as properly formatted though somewhat vague in details, and explained that Clara had left by private carriage to Charleston, where she would board a northbound vessel. Reverend Edwards noted in his personal journal, recovered from his effects after his death in 1872, that he found it curious that young Miss Moore would depart without paying respects to her church community, particularly given her recent increased participation in parish activities. More curious still was Richard Moore's insistence that the matter remain relatively quiet, ostensibly to avoid causing distress to the still ailing Kora. The community largely accepted this explanation, though several young ladies who had recently formed social connections with Clara expressed surprise at her failure to bid them farewell. Within weeks, however, the matter faded from general conversation, replaced by more pressing social concerns as sectional tensions continued to rise. Richard Moore continued his business affairs with seemingly uninterrupted focus, though associates noted he began declining evening invitations, citing a need to be present at home due to his daughter's fragile condition. Harriet Johnston, who had previously made regular appearances at the market and shops, was now rarely seen, with household purchases increasingly made by a newly hired young man named Samuel Green, who responded to all inquiries with polite but firm deflections. When Margaret Hamilton, daughter of the family physician, called at the Moore residence in July with a gift of preserved lemons and inquired after Kora, she was received in the formal parlour by Richard Moore, who thanked her for her consideration but explained that Kora was resting and unable to receive visitors of any kind. Margaret later told her father she observed that all interior doors visible from the parlour were closed and that the house had an unusual stillness, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Cora Moore had always lived in the shadow of her twin sister. Meanwhile, Cora Moore remained entirely absent from public view. According to the private journal of their former music teacher, Madame Elise Fournier, Mademoiselle Clara executes with precision and flair, while Mademoiselle Cora follows notes as though they are rules she fears to break. This dynamic extended beyond music lessons into every aspect of their shared life. At church socials, Clara would engage in spirited conversations, while Cora stood slightly behind her, nodding in agreement. In the rare instances when the twins were seen shopping on Broughton Street, it was Clara who selected fabrics and styles, while Cora carried packages. Even their bedroom, according to Harriet Johnston's later testimony, reflected this imbalance, Clara's side adorned with trinkets and mementos, Cora's sparse and impersonal. What few outside the household realized was the extent to which this imbalance had twisted into something far more sinister in the months leading up to Clara's supposed departure. Beginning in January of 1857, Clara began establishing separate routines from her sister for the first time in their lives. She attended social functions while Kora remained home, ostensibly completing household tasks that had previously been Harriet's responsibility. According to Samuel Blackwood, Eleanor Moore's younger brother who visited the household that February, he observed Kora serving tea to Clara and Richard with the demeanour of a servant rather than a daughter of the house. When he inquired about this arrangement, Richard quickly changed the subject, while Clara smiled in a manner Samuel later described to his wife as unnaturally self-satisfied. Most telling was an incident observed by Mary Peterson, a seamstress called to the house, in March to alter several dresses. While taking measurements in what had been Eleanor's dressing room, she overheard Clara's voice from the adjacent room, saying, "You must try harder, sister. Father says your inadequacy reflects poorly on us both." What Mary found disturbing wasn't merely the harsh words, but the lack of any response from Kora. When Clara entered the dressing room moments later, she was alone and showed no indication that she had just been engaged in conversation. Mary noted that the interior door connecting to the adjacent room was fitted with an unusual lock, one that could only be secured from the outside. From the perspective of Cora Moore, if the fragments of writing found hidden beneath a floorboard in the twins' bedroom in 1952 are indeed authentic, life at the Moore residence had become increasingly unbearable throughout early 1857. The papers, discovered during renovation work and now held in the Savannah Historical Society's sealed collection, contain what appears to be diary entries written in a shaky hand on the backs of household inventory sheets. "Clara watches even as I sleep," one entry reads. "She says mother's affliction runs in my blood alone, that she was spared the taint. Father believes her." Another entry, dated simply March, states, "I am forbidden the front of the house now. Harriet brings meals to my room but won't meet my eyes. I heard Clara telling father that I spoke of running away, which I never did. Now the key turns each night." Most disturbing is an entry that appears to be from April. Dr. Mercer came after I broke the mirror. I couldn't bear seeing her in my face anymore. He seemed kind, but left without helping. Clara says I'll be sent away like mother if I don't improve. She demonstrated what away means by locking me in the root cellar for what felt like days. I believe her now. The final legible entry, undated but presumably from late spring, contains only, "Clara practiced my voice again today." She is becoming very convincing. The authenticity of these writings has been questioned, particularly by Richard Moore's descendants, but graphology experts consulted in 1954 confirmed the handwriting differs significantly from known samples of Clara's penmanship preserved in the family Bible. Furthermore, chemical analysis of the ink suggests it matches the type known to have been used in the Moore household's business ledgers during that time period. What remains unexplained is how these writings remained undiscovered during the subsequent investigation, suggesting either an oversight by authorities or, more disturbingly, deliberate concealment. On the morning of June 23rd, the day of Clara's supposed departure for Hartford, several unusual activities were observed at the Moore residence. According to testimony given by neighboring servant Sarah Johnson during the 1858 inquest, she witnessed Samuel Green making 3 separate trips to the carriage house before dawn, each time carrying what appeared to be a trunk or large case. Around 10 o'clock a closed carriage arrived, but rather than stopping at the front entrance as would be customary for a departing guest, it was directed to the rear of the property. Sarah, whose kitchen window afforded a partial view of the Moore's back garden, reported seeing Richard Moore emerge briefly with what appeared to be Clara, though the young woman was heavily veiled and walked with a stiffness unlike Miss Clara's usual grace. The carriage departed shortly thereafter, but what struck Sarah as particularly unusual was that Richard did not accompany his daughter, instead returning inside immediately. Throughout the remainder of that day, the house remained closed up and unusually quiet. No lamps were lit in the front rooms that evening, though Sarah reported seeing movement behind the curtains of the 3rd floor, the small rooms where the household servants slept. The following morning, Harriet Johnston appeared at the market looking, in the words of several witnesses, as though she had aged a decade overnight. When Elizabeth Harrington inquired after Clara's departure, Harriet reportedly whispered, "Some things are better left unspoken, Mrs. Harrington," before abruptly walking away, leaving several purchases behind. That same day, Richard Moore visited his solicitor, Alexander Grant, and executed changes to his will. According to Grant's clerk, Oliver Pembroke, the new document contained unusual provisions regarding the continued care and maintenance of someone referred to only as the remaining dependent, with specific instructions that this individual was to remain in the family home under proper supervision, regardless of any future circumstances. The investigation that never fully materialized in 1857 found new life in February 1858, when a letter arrived at the Hartford Female Seminary inquiring after Clara Moore's progress. The letter, sent by Reverend Edwards in response to concerns expressed by several parishioners who had received no correspondence from Clara, despite her promises to write, prompted the seminary's administration to reply that no student by that name had ever been enrolled or even applied for admission. This response reached Savannah just as the city was processing another disturbing development. Richard Moore had been found dead in his study, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. According to Sheriff Wilson's official report, Richard's body was discovered by Samuel Green when he arrived to deliver the morning's business correspondence. A note found on the desk read simply, "I can bear this burden no longer. God forgive me. Initial assumptions centered on financial ruin, but examination of Moore's business records showed his affairs to be in excellent order. Sheriff Wilson, accompanied by Dr. Mercer and Reverend Edwards, conducted a thorough search of the house, finding Harriet Johnston in a state of extreme distress, repeatedly stating that she should have spoken sooner, but refusing to elaborate. The most disturbing discovery came when the men insisted on examining the cellar despite Harriet's protests. There, behind a recently constructed brick wall in the wine room, they found a small chamber containing a narrow bed, chamber pot, and several books. The space showed evidence of recent occupation, including food scraps and a water pitcher. There was no sign of either Moore or daughter, though a thorough search of the house revealed that while Clara's belongings appeared to have been packed and removed, Cora's clothing and personal items remained neatly arranged in what had been the twins' shared bedroom. When questioned directly about the cellar room, Harriet Johnston collapsed in what Dr. Mercer described as acute nervous prostration and was unable to provide coherent responses. Samuel Green, meanwhile, had disappeared, last seen boarding a westbound train the morning Richard's body was discovered. What was never found in the 1858 investigation, what couldn't have been found, was the truth that would only emerge through a series of disconnected discoveries over the subsequent century. A trunk containing women's clothing monogrammed CM was discovered in 1862, washed ashore near Tybee Island after a violent storm. The contents, water-damaged but identifiable, included several dresses in styles consistent with those known to have been owned by the Moore twins, as well as a silver-backed hairbrush containing strands of auburn hair. More significant was the discovery in 1893 of a small leather-bound book among the effects of Dr. James Mercer after his death. The book, which appeared to be a secondary private medical journal, contained entries regarding his interactions with the Moore family that were notably absent from his official records. In an entry dated April 1857, he wrote, "I fear I have failed in my duty. The young woman's injuries were clearly not self-inflicted as claimed. The angles of the lacerations and their pattern suggest a right-handed assailant standing before her, while the patient herself is left-handed, according to my observations. More troubling was her terror when her sister entered the room, though she attempted to mask it. I recommended removal from the household, but suspect my advice went unheeded." A later entry dated February 1858, after the discovery of Richard Moore's body, stated, "The cellar room confirms my worst suspicions, yet raises more questions. Was it Clara or Cora who was kept there? Was it Clara or Cora who was sent away? The identical nature of the twins makes this determination impossible without direct examination of both young women. I'm increasingly convinced that the one who smiled so coldly at me during my house call was not the same one who trembled under my care weeks earlier." Perhaps most chilling was a document discovered in 1937 during the demolition of the old First Bank of Savannah building, a safety deposit box registration in the name of Clara Moore, dated July 1857, a full month after she had supposedly departed for Hartford. The signature on the document, when compared with known examples of both twins' handwriting by modern forensic experts, was determined to match neither perfectly, but rather appeared to be an amalgamation of their styles, as though someone had been practicing to forge a hybrid of the two. The truth that began to surface in the summer of 1858 started not with grand revelations, but with whispered conversations and reluctant testimonies. Harriet Johnston, after recovering from her initial collapse, provided a statement to Sheriff Wilson that painted a disturbing picture of life in the Moore household. According to transcripts preserved in the county records, Harriet described how Clara had begun to exhibit increasingly controlling behavior toward her sister following their 18th birthday in October 1856. "It started with small cruelties," Harriet stated. She would speak for her sister in company, interrupting whenever Miss Kora attempted to express herself. By early 1857, According to Harriet, Richard Moore had begun to show preference for Clara, believing her to be the stronger twin, unburdened by her mother's nervous disposition. This favoritism emboldened Clara, who gradually convinced her father that Kora was becoming unstable and required increasing restrictions for her own safety. The April incident that brought Miss Clara would hide Miss Cora's belongings, then accuse her of carelessness. Mercer to the house had not been a self-inflicted injury as claimed, but rather the result of Kora attempting to defend herself when Clara threatened her with sewing shears during a dispute over a necklace that had belonged to their mother. In the aftermath, with Richard believing Clara's version of events, Kora had been confined to her room, then later to the cellar space as her episodes supposedly worsened. What Harriet could not, or would not, explain was the events of June 23rd. "I was told to prepare Miss Clara's belongings for her journey," she testified. "Mr. Moore instructed me to remain in my quarters that entire day. I heard the carriage arrive and depart. When I was permitted downstairs the following morning, Mr. Moore informed me that Miss Clara had gone to Hertford and that we were not to discuss her departure with anyone outside the household. He said nothing about Miss Cora, and I—" Here, according to the transcript, Harriet broke down, unable to continue. When she resumed her testimony hours later, she would only say, "I believe Mr. Moore came to realize what Miss Clara had done, but too late to make it right." From the vantage point of the present day, with documents scattered across decades and institutions, a clearer picture emerges of what likely occurred in the Moore residence in the spring and summer of 1857. Clara Moore, the dominant twin who had long resented sharing her identity with a sister she considered inferior, began a calculated campaign to eliminate Kora from their shared existence. First, by isolating her socially, then by convincing their father of her mental instability, Clara systematically erased her twin's presence in Savannah society. The cellar room, based on architectural analysis conducted in 1966, when the property was being converted into a museum, had been modified gradually over several months, first with improved locks, then with sound-dampening materials, and finally with the false wall that concealed its existence from casual observation. Clara's sudden interest in traveling north, expressed in the weeks before her supposed departure, appears to have been groundwork for her eventual explanation for Kora's permanent disappearance. Except in her narrative, it would be Clara who left and Kora who remained. The evidence suggests that on June 23rd, someone departed the Moore residence by carriage, but it was almost certainly Kora, not Clara, who left Savannah that day. Whether she left alive remains the most disturbing unanswered question. The trunk discovered near Tybee Island years later suggests a grim possibility, particularly given the property's proximity to the route ships would take when leaving Savannah Harbor. More likely, based on the safety deposit box registration and other documents, is that Clara assumed her sister's identity after eliminating her, then realized she would need to explain the continued absence of Clara while she herself lived publicly as Kora, hence the elaborate fiction of the Hartford Seminary. This theory is supported by the testimony of several acquaintances who, in the months following Richard's suicide, commented on how Kora seemed transformed by grief, displaying confidence and assertiveness previously associated only with Clara. As Sheriff Wilson noted in his final report on the matter, the remaining Miss Moore bears watching, though no evidence exists to bring charges of any kind. On a cold January morning in 1859, nearly a year after Richard Moore's suicide, a woman identifying herself as Cora Moore visited the offices of Alexander Grant, the family solicitor, to claim her inheritance. According to Grant's records, he found himself discomfited by the young woman's demeanor. noting that she demonstrated a comprehensive knowledge of her father's business affairs that seemed inconsistent with the sheltered existence Miss Cora was known to have led. Nevertheless, with all documentation in order, Grant transferred control of the Moore assets to her. Within weeks, she had sold the family home and most of their possessions, keeping only a small collection of jewelry and personal items. Savannah society buzzed with speculation about her plans, but few were prepared when she announced her intention to travel to Europe indefinitely. Before her departure in March, she attended one final service at Christ Church, where Reverend Edwards later recalled she approached him after the benediction. "She thanked me for my kindness to her family," he wrote in his journal, then said something that haunts me still. "Reverend," she told me, "isn't it remarkable how grief can change a person? Sometimes I hardly recognize myself." The woman known as Cora Moore boarded a ship bound for Liverpool the following day and vanished from Savannah's historical record. Periodic reports surfaced over subsequent decades. A Moore woman operating a successful import business in London in the 1870s. A wealthy American widow by the same surname purchasing a villa in southern France in 1882. A donation to the Savannah Orphan Asylum in 1901, signed simply CM. But no definitive trace of either Clara or Cora Moore was ever confirmed. The Moore family home changed hands multiple times, each new owner reporting unusual cold spots in certain rooms and inexplicable sounds emanating from the sealed cellar. In 1928, during renovations, workers discovered a space beneath the main staircase containing a small wooden box. Inside was a silver locket containing twinned locks of auburn hair and an inscription reading simply, "Two as one." One remains. The current whereabouts of this locket are unknown, as it disappeared from the Savannah Historical Society's collection in 1963, the same year the Moore family papers were being catalogued. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made in 1969 during expansion of the harbour facilities. Workers dredging near where ships would have anchored in the mid-19th century recovered a small lady's boot containing bones of a human foot, the leather preserved by the harbour mud. Forensic examination determined the boot to be consistent with styles from the 1850s, sized for a young woman and monogrammed inside with the letter M. The remains were too degraded for further identification and were eventually interred in an unmarked grave in Bonaventure Cemetery, alongside countless other unnamed souls from Savannah's shadowed past. The sound that still echoes through Savannah's historic district isn't a scream or a cry, but rather a whisper, the gentle rustle of skirts along a hallway, the soft closing of a door when no one is present, the occasional glimpse of a young woman in outdated dress reflected in shop windows along Broughton Street. Local tour guides have incorporated the Moore twins' mystery into their ghost walk narratives, though they typically embellish with fabricated details of spectral twin apparitions seeking justice. The truth, as this investigation has shown, is far more mundane and far more terrifying. Not a tale of supernatural vengeance, but of calculated human malevolence that successfully evaded accountability. When the Moore family home was converted into a bed and breakfast in 1972, the owners reported occasional strange occurrences. Guests claiming to hear a young woman's voice asking, "Which one am I today?" Most dismissed these stories as marketing ploys to attract the tourist trade, until the establishment closed suddenly in 1987, following an incident the owners refused to discuss publicly. County records indicate they sold the property at a significant loss and relocated to Arizona, never returning to Savannah. The building remained vacant until 1994, when it was purchased by the Historical Society and converted into administrative offices. Staff working late occasionally report finding doors locked that should be open or opened that should be locked. Most telling is the persistent difficulty in maintaining accurate inventory of the Moore family artifacts in the Society's collection. Items disappearing from secured cases only to reappear in unexpected locations, particularly anything bearing the initials CM. As one longtime employee reportedly stated, it's as though someone is still trying to sort out which items belong to which sister. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to this disturbing case comes from the journal of Harriet Johnston, discovered in 1966 in the possession of her great-granddaughter in Mobile, Alabama. The final entry, dated shortly before her death in 1863, reads, "I dream of them still, standing side by side as they did as children, before the darkness came between them. In these dreams I cannot tell them apart, and I wake wondering if anyone ever truly could. The sin was not in their sameness, but in our willingness to believe they were different. May God have mercy on us all. What the historical record cannot fully capture is the psychological deterioration that occurred within the Moore household in those final months. According to household accounts, ledgers examined during the 1967 archival reorganization, expenditures for laudanum and other medicinal compounds increased dramatically, beginning in February 1857. More telling was the series of payments to Dr. Frederick Hastings, a physician not previously associated with the family, whose specialty was nervous disorders and feminine hysteria. His private papers, donated to the Medical College of Georgia in 1941, make reference to consultations regarding an unnamed young lady of good family, whose condition required specialized restraints for her protection during episodes of delusional identity. The papers include sketches for a device resembling a modified straight waistcoat, with notation suggesting it was designed to be concealed beneath conventional clothing when necessary for public appearances. The psychological dimensions of Clara Moore's calculated campaign against her sister become even more disturbing when considered alongside fragments of correspondence discovered in 1971. A series of letters addressed to "My dearest E" and signed simply R, presumably from Richard Moore to his institutionalized wife Eleanor, were found sealed within the wall of what had been his study during renovation work. Dating from 1853 through 1856, the letters document Richard's growing concern about Clara's behavior toward her twin. "She watches C with an intensity that borders on obsession," one letter states. "Yesterday, I observed her mimicking her sister's mannerisms when she believed herself unobserved, as though rehearsing." Another, dated December 1855, reads, "You were right to worry about the girls. I dismissed your concerns as maternal anxiety, but now I see what you saw. The resemblance between them has become a fixation for Clara. She speaks of being the better version and suggests that one twin is unnecessary." Most chilling is the final letter, never sent, dated January 1857. "I fear I have favored the wrong daughter all these years. What I took for strength in Clara may instead be something far darker. She spoke today of how convenient it would be if Kora simply wasn't anymore, how she could manage both their roles without anyone noticing the difference. I must consider separating them before matters worsen." The theory that Clara successfully assumed Kora's identity after eliminating her sister gained additional support from an unexpected source in 1978. During renovation of the former First Bank of Savannah building, workers discovered a forgotten vault containing unclaimed safety deposit boxes, including one registered to C. Moore. Inside was a small diary with entries spanning from July 1857 through February 1858. The handwriting matches samples authenticated as Clara's, yet the writer consistently refers to herself as Kora. More disturbing are entries that suggest a fracturing identity. "Sometimes I forget and sign the wrong name," one passage reads. Today at the milliner's, I nearly gave myself away by selecting fabrics Clara would have chosen. I must be more careful. Another entry states, I dreamed of the cellar again. In the dream, I am both the one who locks the door and the one behind it, calling out in a voice that is both hers and mine. The final entry, dated the day before Richard Moore's suicide, contains only, Father knows. He looked at me today and called me by her name, not as a mistake but as an accusation. He knows what I have done. The exact fate of Cora Moore remains the central mystery of this case. The trunk discovered near Tybee Island contained personal items belonging to both twins, suggesting a deliberate attempt to dispose of evidence. Shipping records from June 1857 show no passenger named Moore on any vessel departing Savannah, though several ships carried unnamed female passengers listed simply as companion to various merchants or ship officers. More significant was the discovery in 1983 of an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field section of Colonial Park Cemetery. Ground-penetrating radar, conducted during an archaeological survey, revealed a burial inconsistent with the cemetery's standard practices, a coffin placed perpendicular to the others in what appeared to be a hasty and concealed interment. When exhumed under the supervision of the Historical Society, the remains were determined to be those of a young woman approximately 19 years of age, who had died from a severe trauma to the base of the skull. Personal effects included a silver thimble engraved with the letter C and fragments of a dress made from fabric matching descriptions of the twins' spring wardrobes from 1857. Without modern DNA analysis, definitive identification was impossible, but the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests these may have been Cora Moore's remains. The psychological profile that emerges of Clara Moore through these scattered historical fragments is that of a young woman whose identity had become inextricably entangled with her twins. Born into a society that valued conformity in women while simultaneously demanding they distinguish themselves through subtle social competitions, the identical twins presented a unique dilemma. Clara, apparently the more dominant from childhood, seems to have developed what modern psychologists might identify as a malignant narcissism, viewing her sister simultaneously as an extension of herself and as a threat to her unique identity. The calculated elimination of Kora, whether through murder or through forced confinement and exile, represents not merely the removal of a rival, but a distorted attempt at individuation. Most disturbing is the evidence suggesting that after assuming Cora's identity, Clara experienced a psychological merger with her absent twin, essentially becoming both sisters at once. Richard Moore's suicide appears to have been precipitated by his belated recognition of what had occurred under his own roof. Bank records show he made a series of unusual transactions in the weeks before his death, including the establishment of a trust with instructions that funds be forwarded annually to the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville, presumably to ensure Eleanor's continued care. He also transferred a significant sum to a separate account accessible only to Alexander Grant, with instructions that it be used for the recovery and care of CM should she ever return to Savannah. The careful ambiguity of these initials, potentially applying to either twin, suggests Richard himself may have become uncertain which daughter remained and which had vanished. The aftermath of the Moore family tragedy extended well beyond the immediate principals. Samuel Green, the household servant who disappeared after Richard's suicide, resurfaced in New Orleans in 1861, where he provided a statement to a local newspaper regarding the evil that occurs behind closed doors in the finest homes of Savannah. Though the article was vague regarding specifics, presumably to avoid libel, Green described witnessing a young woman of good family practicing deceit so complete she could assume another's identity entirely, fooling even those who believed they knew her well. He claimed to have assisted in removing evidence that would have revealed unspeakable crimes under threat to his own life, and expressed profound regret for his complicity. Green reportedly died of yellow fever shortly after giving this statement. Though no death certificate has been located, Harriet Johnston remained in Savannah after the Moore family's dissolution, living in reduced circumstances and rarely speaking of her former employers. According to her great-granddaughter's recollections, recorded in a 1967 oral history project, Harriet suffered from chronic insomnia and would often wake screaming from nightmares she refused to describe. She became known for a peculiar habit of addressing young women she encountered on the street by random names, as though testing their responses. When questioned about this behavior, she would reportedly say only, "You can never be certain who stands before you in this world." The woman who departed Savannah as Cora Moore in 1859 left a sporadic trail through Europe over subsequent decades. Shipping records confirm her arrival in Liverpool, after which she appears in various business ledgers and property transactions across England and France. A daguerreotype, discovered in a London photography studio's archived materials, shows a woman matching her description in 1865, though the subject is identified only as American lady, repeat customer. The image shows a well-dressed woman in her late 20s, seated with perfect posture and wearing a curious expression, a half-smile that, in the words of the photography historian who discovered the image, suggests someone pleased with a private joke. More substantial. Evidence comes from Paris police records from 1872, documenting an incident in which an American widow named Moore was briefly detained after being observed having an animated conversation with herself in the Tuileries garden, alternately speaking in different voices and responding to questions no one had asked. The final confirmed trace of any Moore twin comes from a nursing home in Geneva, Switzerland, where records indicate a patient identified as C. Moore, American expatriate, was admitted in 1897 at approximately 60 years of age. The admitting physician noted the patient suffered from pronounced dissociative states and identity confusion, often referring to herself in the third person and claiming to be two people inhabiting one body. The most disturbing note in her file, uncovered by researchers in 1989, describes an incident in which the patient was discovered in the facility's garden, systematically pulling petals from flowers while alternating between two distinct voices, one commanding, one pleading. When approached by staff, she reportedly looked up with perfect clarity and said, "You mustn't separate us again." Neither of us would survive it a second time. Patient records indicate she died in 1903 and was buried in an unmarked grave at her own request, specified in a legal document prepared years earlier that was signed Clara and Cora Moore in a single flowing hand. The Moore case represents a unique intersection of historical investigation and psychological study. A 19th-century crime pieced together through fragments across more than a century. Unlike more notorious cases from the period, it never captured widespread public attention, perhaps because its horror lies not in graphic violence, but in the more subtle terror of identity theft in its most literal form. What makes the case particularly disturbing from a modern perspective is not merely the apparent murder of Cora Moore, but Clara's subsequent psychological absorption of her twin, a parasitic merging that suggests the elimination was never truly complete. Scholars of Savannah history have noted that the period immediately following the Moore incident saw a marked decrease in twin births being publicly celebrated in local society. Several prominent families with twin children born in the 1860s and 70s chose to send one child to be raised by relatives elsewhere, a practice previously uncommon among the city's elite. Whether this represented conscious avoidance of associations with the Moore case or a deeper, unspoken anxiety about twinned identities remains speculative, but the pattern is statistically significant enough to suggest cultural impact. The Moore residence, currently housing administrative offices for the Historical Society, continues to generate reports of unusual phenomena. Staff members describe experiencing sudden shifts in temperature when handling artifacts associated with the twins, particularly items bearing their initials. In 1996, a research assistant cataloguing the Moore family papers reported hearing a woman's voice whisper, "Which one am I today?" though she was alone in the building at the time. Most frequently reported is the sensation of being watched while in certain rooms, particularly the space that once served as the twins' bedroom and the basement area where the concealed chamber was discovered. Whether these experiences represent genuine paranormal phenomena or the psychological impact of working in a space with such a disturbing history is impossible to determine, but they speak to the lingering power of the narrative. Perhaps most unsettling about the Moore twins case is how it challenges fundamental assumptions about identity and recognition. In an era before photography was commonplace, identity relied heavily on social recognition and behavioral consistency. Clara Moore's apparent ability to completely assume her sister's identity, not merely physically, but socially and legally, exposes the fragility of these systems. Her success in maintaining this deception, even among people who had known both twins for years, raises disturbing questions about how well we truly know those closest to us, and about the performative nature of identity itself. The historical record contains one final ambiguous footnote to this case. In 1917, nearly 60 years after the events at the Moore residence, an elderly woman visited Christ Church in Savannah asking to see parish records from the 1850s. The church secretary, Eliza Pemberton, later reported that the woman examined the baptismal records for the Moore twins with particular interest, then asked to visit the family plot in the churchyard. Though no grave existed for either twin, the woman spent several minutes standing at the marker for Richard Moore. According to Ms. Pemberton's account, preserved in church archives, the woman placed 2 identical white roses on the grave before departing. When asked if she was related to the family, the visitor reportedly smiled and said, "In a manner of speaking, I am what remains of them." She declined to provide her name and was never identified, though Ms. Pemberton noted she spoke with the refined accent of someone who had spent many years abroad. The visitor book from that day contains a single entry in elegant script that has been the subject of much speculation. "The twins have come home." Whether this represented an elderly Clara Moore making a final return to Savannah, some other family connection, or simply a curious tourist drawn by local legends cannot be determined. But it serves as a fitting conclusion to a case defined by ambiguity and unresolved identity. Modern visitors to Savannah who walk past the former Moore residence often report an unsettling sensation, particularly at dusk when shadows blur the distinctive architectural features. Some claim to glimpse a figure watching from the third-floor window, always a young woman in outdated dress, sometimes one figure, sometimes 2 standing close together. Long-time residents avoid the building after dark, crossing to the opposite side of the street rather than passing directly before it. Perhaps most telling is the local custom that has emerged among Savannah's youth. When passing the house in pairs, particularly sisters, they instinctively clasp hands. When asked why, most cannot articulate a specific reason, only a vague sense that it is important to maintain connection, to not let go, to remain certain of who is who when walking in the shadow of the house where Clara and Cora Moore once lived, and where one of them vanished while somehow remaining present, a ghost created not through death, but through the more terrifying prospect of one identity consumed by another. As we conclude this investigation into one of Savannah's most disturbing historical cases, we are left with questions that documents alone cannot answer. What transformed Clara Moore from sister to predator? What were Cora's final moments like as she realized her identity was being systematically erased? Did Richard Moore enable the horror through his favoritism and willful blindness, only to face the truth too late? And perhaps most disturbingly, in those final decades in Europe, who exactly was living behind the name Cora Moore? Was it Clara alone, Clara believing herself to be Kora, or some fractured merger of both identities within a single consciousness? The passage of time ensures these questions will remain unanswered. The house stands, the graves remain, the whispers continue, and somewhere in the historical shadow of Savannah society, the truth of what happened between two sisters who shared a face but not a fate waits in silence, neither fully revealed nor completely forgotten. The most terrifying aspect of the Moore twins' story is not what we know, but what we can never know, the intimate horror that occurred in private moments between two people who began life as mirror images of each other and ended it as a single, fractured reflection.